Okay, we are on 1-3 properties of numbers, found on page 16 through page 24. Properties of numbers. The first thing in which I need to teach you is the properties of equality. Equality literally means equals. So all of these properties that I'm about to show you has to deal with the equal sign. So when we're talking about reflexive property, I like to use the hint word reflection. Reflection means exactly what I see. So I look in the mirror and I see myself. So if I have the letter A, I know A will equal A. In number terms, 4 equals 4. It is the exact same thing. As well as I could even say 3 plus 4 equals 3 plus 4. It's the exact same. The left side is the right side. Symmetric, my key word is symmetry. Symmetry means the left side is the same as the right side. So, here's what I mean. If I were to put the left side as the same as the right, then I can say that the right is the same as the left. That's what symmetry means. So, if I were to say A equals B, then I know B equals A. I can put the left side to the right side to the left. So if I'm talking about numbers, then I can say 3 plus 4. If 3 plus 4 equals 7, then I know that 7 equals 3 plus 4. Left side equals the right side equals the left. Then we get to the transitive property. When I think of transitive, I think of translator. A translator. So let's say that I speak English and I speak to somebody who speaks English and Spanish. Well, then the English and Spanish person can speak Spanish. So I need a translator. I need somebody in the middle. So translator would be this. If I know A equals B and B equals C, then I know A has to equal C. B is like my translator. What do I mean by this? Here's what I mean. If I know that 6 plus 9 equals 15, and I also know that 8 plus 7 equals 15, I apologize. Let me do a better one. If I say 6 plus 9 equals 15, or actually, if 6 plus 9 equals, if I know 6 plus 9 is the same as 5 plus 10, and I know that 5 plus 10 equals 15, then I know that 6 plus 9 has to equal 15. There is a middle person within my translator, my transitive. Then we get to this substitution property. Substitution is literally to substitute. If I were to substitute, I could say x equals 4, or if x equals 4, then I know that 3x, I could substitute and say 3x is the same thing as 3 times 4. I substitute. Then we get to the addition properties. This has to deal with the addition. So the additive identity. Identity means I get back myself. So Identity means myself. Additive means to add. What can I add to get back myself? So if I have a plus 0, that's what I can add to get back myself, a. So 5 plus 0 is 5. That is the additive identity. Anytime that I add 0, I get back myself. The additive inverse. Inverse means the opposite. That means I could take a plus the opposite of a, which is negative a, will always give me 0. So an example, if I take 5 and I add its opposite, negative 5, then I get back 0. That is the additive inverse. Then we get to multiplicative properties. Within multiplicative properties, we have the multiplicative identity. So instead of adding, I need to multiply by something to get back myself. Well, the only number that works is 1. A times 1 will give me back a. 5 times 1 will give me back 5. If I multiply anything by 1, I get back itself. Multiplicative property of 0. If I take a and I multiply it by 0, then I know I will get 0. 5 times 0 would give me 0. The last property in which we have is the multiplicative inverse. Inverse means the opposite. So, here we go. Within the multiplicative inverse, I could say something like this. If I had a over b, then I would multiply, since it's multiplicative, I would multiply by the inverse, the opposite. I would flip it, the reciprocal. B times a. This will always give me 1. So I could say 5 over 4, and if I multiply that by its inverse, 4 over 5, I'm always going to get 1, because 5 times 4 is 20, 4 times 5 is 20, which is 1. Multiplicative inverse. So let's go ahead and look at example 1. We must evaluate this and name the property used. So, how did I get from here to over here? The first thing they did is they did parentheses. So they took 4 minus 3. They say 4 minus 3 is 1. The only property that states I take one thing and I insert it would be my substitution property. 4 minus 3 becomes 1. This is substitution. How do we get from this to this? What changed? What changed is they took 7 times 1. Anything times 1 is itself. I multiplied. Identity, anything times 1 is itself, so it has to be the multiplicative identity. Multiplicative identity. I'm going to put ID for identity. Then they took 5 times 1/5. 5 is the same as 5 over 1. They multiplied by the reciprocal, the inverse. If I multiply by the inverse, I get 1. What property? Multiplicative inverse. Multiply by the inverse, we get 1. This is called the multiplicative inverse. Then they say 7 minus 1 becomes 6. Well, that's substitution. There's no other property. And then 6 plus 1 to become 7. Substitution. Those are the steps in which we use to solve the problem. Go ahead and try 1A. by yourself. On guided practice 1A, here's what they did. They took 4 times 2 to get 8. Well, what's the only property in which to get that? Is the substitution. It's the substitution property. Then they say 8 minus 8 is 0. 8 minus 8. If I add the opposite, well, Mr. Bourne, this is 8 minus 8. I understand. A plus negative a is the same thing as a minus a to get 0. 5 plus negative 5 is the same thing as 5 minus 5 to get 0. So the property in which they used was the additive inverse. Then they take 2 times 3 to get 6. 2 times 3 would be the substitution. Substitution. And then 6 plus 0. If I add anything to 0, I get myself. If I add anything to 0, so I'm adding anything to 0, I get myself. So the additive identity. Additive ID, additive identity. Let's go ahead with 1B. On 1B, go ahead and pause the video and try. On 1B, they do parentheses first. They must divide first. 15 divided by 3 is 5. Substitution is the property they used. 5 minus 5, just like we saw 8 minus 8. This has to be the additive inverse. Okay? Then they have 7 times 1 over 7 becomes 1. So 7 over 1 times the inverse. Multiplicative inverse becomes 1. Multiplicative inverse. 6 times 0 is 0. So anything multiplied by 0 is 0. Anything multiplied by 0 is 0. So that's the multiplicative property of 0. Multiplicative property of 0. One plus 0, so anything plus 0 is itself. Additive ID, additive identity. Example 3, evaluate using properties of numbers. I have all multiplication. So I'm going to group these two because I need to multiply them first. 5 times 7, and I group them. 5 times 7 if I group them, the left side equals the right side equals the left. So it doesn't matter which one I use. So I'm going to take 5 times 7 and then I'll go ahead and I will take 4 times 2. So whenever I do this, then I went ahead and I used the when I look at this, we are literally not going to do this one, or this one. And the reason being is because they are using properties, and all we need to do is just go ahead and use a substitution property by just multiplying. So they're doing things in which we don't need to do. The things that I do need us to understand are these top ones.